Chapter 1. The Birth of a Monster. In the bustling cities and quiet suburbs of 1980s Japan, a sense of order and peace prevailed. It was a time of rapid technological growth, a society shaped by tradition and the relentless march of modernity. But beneath the surface, hidden in the shadows, one man's twisted impulses would shatter that peace forever. Between 1988 and 1989, 4 young girls would vanish from the Saitama and Tokyo regions, only to be found later, their lives cut short in the most horrific ways imaginable. The man responsible for these heinous acts would later be known as the Otaku Killer, or the Monster of Saitama. His crimes would expose the darkest corners of the human psyche and force Japan to reckon with its assumptions about innocence, safety, and the dangers that lurk behind closed doors. But the truth behind his crimes, what he did to his victims, and the disturbing secrets hidden within his home, would shake Japan to its core and leave a lasting scar on the national consciousness. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born on August 21st, 1962, in Ome, Tokyo. On the surface, his upbringing seemed typical, but beneath the exterior lay a childhood marked by rejection and alienation. From birth, Miyazaki faced a physical deformity. His hands were fused to his wrists, preventing him from rotating them properly. This abnormality, known as a congenital hand deformity, became a source of ridicule, leaving him an outcast among his peers. In a society that placed immense value on conformity and appearance, his condition marked him as different, a stigma that followed him throughout his early life. Despite coming from a wealthy family that owned a successful publishing business, Miyazaki's emotional needs were neglected. His parents were distant, preoccupied with the family's professional legacy, while his 2 younger sisters often took priority. Miyazaki's father, in particular, was described as cold and unaffectionate, showing little interest in his son's emotional well-being. This emotional neglect deepened Miyazaki's feelings of invisibility. He grew up in a house filled with material wealth, but devoid of warmth or affection, a perfect breeding ground for psychological turmoil. From an early age, Miyazaki showed signs of being different. He was unusually quiet and withdrawn, spending long hours alone. At school, his classmates teased him relentlessly for his physical deformity, and he struggled to form friendships. The rejection he faced at home and in social settings drove him deeper into isolation, and he began to retreat into a world of fantasy and imagination to cope with his feelings of inadequacy. In school, despite his social struggles, Miyazaki initially excelled academically. He attended Meiji University's junior college, a prestigious institution where he studied English literature. However, as time passed, his academic performance deteriorated. Some speculate that his declining interest in his studies was linked to his increasing preoccupation with the fantasy worlds he used to escape reality. His inability to connect with others on an emotional level, combined with the constant sense of alienation, laid the foundation for the psychological decay that would later manifest in his crimes. One of the few sources of comfort in his life was his grandfather. The elderly man was a warm, caring presence, perhaps the only adult figure who offered Miyazaki any form of emotional support. However, this fragile connection was severed when his grandfather died. The loss devastated Miyazaki. In a chilling and bizarre display of grief, he later claimed to have consumed part of his grandfather's ashes, a sign that his grip on reality was beginning to unravel. As Miyazaki entered adulthood, the scars of his childhood remained raw and unhealed. His sense of isolation grew more profound, and his fantasies became darker and more violent. His apartment, small and cluttered, reflected the chaos of his inner world. And within the walls of that apartment, the seeds of unspeakable horror had already begun to take root. Chapter 2. The Descent into Darkness. By the time Tsutomu Miyazaki reached his mid-20s, the fragile line between reality and fantasy had begun to blur. His childhood alienation had evolved into something far more dangerous, a growing compulsion to assert control in the most horrifying ways imaginable. Isolated from human connection, Miyazaki turned to manga and anime to escape his reality. Initially, these interests were innocent, reflecting the popular culture of the time. But over the years, his consumption shifted toward violent and sexually explicit content, reflecting a growing detachment from societal norms. His vast collection of videos, ranging from harmless cartoons to grotesque and graphic horror films, became an obsession, a way to fuel the fantasies that consumed his mind. The growing prevalence of otaku culture during the 1980s, a subculture of obsessive fan devotion to manga, anime, and other media, provided a mask for his more sinister fixations. By 1988, Miyazaki's inner turmoil could no longer be contained. What began as voyeuristic fantasies soon escalated to physical violence. The mental barriers that separated thought from action collapsed, and his desire to control and destroy became unstoppable. His crimes were not impulsive acts. They were the result of years of internalized rage, loneliness, and a desperate need to assert power over those more vulnerable than himself. What made Miyazaki particularly chilling was his ability to maintain a facade of normalcy. By day, he worked as a photo technician, an unremarkable job that allowed him to remain unnoticed. But by night, he became a predator, lurking in quiet neighborhoods, searching for his next victim. Between 1988 and 1989, Miyazaki would abduct and kill 4 girls between the ages of 4 and 7. His crimes were methodical, reflecting the cold precision of a man who had long fantasized about death. Each abduction followed a similar pattern. He would lure the girls into his car under false pretenses, isolate them in remote areas, and subject them to unimaginable horrors before ultimately taking their lives. His first known victim was 4-year-old Mari Kono. On August 22, 1988, just one day after his 26th birthday, Miyazaki spotted her playing alone. Seizing the opportunity, he lured her into his vehicle and drove to a secluded wooded area. There, away from the eyes of the world, he ended her young life in a brutal and calculated act that marked the beginning of his killing spree. What followed was even more disturbing. Rather than leaving the scene immediately, Miyazaki stayed with Mari's body for hours. He later confessed to engaging in necrophilic acts, a chilling insight into the depth of his depravity. When he finally abandoned her remains, he did so with the knowledge that her family would be left to endure the agony of not knowing her fate. But Miyazaki was not content to simply kill. He wanted to prolong the suffering of those left behind. In a calculated act of psychological torment, he sent Mari's family a package. Inside, they found a haunting message written in kanji characters. Mari, cremated, bones, investigate. Prove, along with the note, were small fragments of Mari's bones and teeth. It was a message of control, a declaration that he held the power over life and death. In the months that followed, 3 more girls would fall victim to Miyazaki's twisted desires. Each abduction, each killing, followed the same pattern of cold calculation and post-mortem desecration. His ability to evade capture for so long was a testament to both his careful planning and the police's struggle to comprehend the scale of the horror they were facing. But despite his meticulous efforts to remain hidden, fate would soon intervene. And when Tsutomu Miyazaki was finally caught, the horrors he left behind would leave Japan forever changed. Chapter 3: A Trail of Terror. As 1988 turned to 1989, Tsutomu Miyazaki's hunger for control and violence only intensified. The abduction and murder of 4-year-old Mari Kono had awakened something within him, an unquenchable thirst for power over life and death. But it wasn't just the act of killing that satisfied him. For Miyazaki, the aftermath, taunting the families, reliving his crimes through photographs, and maintaining a connection to his victims, was just as crucial. Less than 2 months after taking Mari's life, Miyazaki struck again. This time, his victim was Masami Yoshizawa, a 7-year-old girl walking home alone from a friend's house. It was October 3rd, 1988, a quiet evening in the city of Hano. Spotting her as he drove through a residential neighborhood, Miyazaki pulled his car over and lured her in with a friendly demeanor. She had no reason to suspect the danger lurking behind his soft voice and ordinary appearance. As with his previous crime, Miyazaki took Masami to an isolated location deep in the countryside. There, he subjected her to unimaginable horrors before ending her young life. But his obsession did not stop at the act of killing. He documented the scene with a camera, preserving his crimes in a series of macabre photographs. These images would later be discovered among the hundreds of videotapes found in his apartment, evidence of a mind completely consumed by its darkest impulses. The disappearance of Masami Yoshizawa sent shockwaves through the community. Parents became more protective of their children, while police scrambled to find leads. But Miyazaki was careful. He left no obvious physical evidence, and his unassuming nature made it difficult for investigators to link him to the crime. Despite their best efforts, the case grew cold, just as he had planned. For Miyazaki, the lack of consequences only emboldened him. The boundaries between his fantasies and reality had crumbled completely, and the act of taking life became a compulsion he could no longer resist. On December 12, 1988, he targeted his third victim, 4-year-old Erika Namba. She was walking home from a friend's house in Sayama when Miyazaki approached her. Using the same tactics he had perfected with his previous victims, he coaxed her into his car. This time, however, his cruelty reached new levels. After taking Erika's life, Miyazaki staged her body in a grotesque manner before abandoning it near a parking lot. It was a deliberate act of defiance, a taunt to the authorities and a demonstration of his sense of control. Days after Erika's murder, Miyazaki escalated his psychological warfare. He sent a postcard to the girl's family, a cruel message that simply read, "Erika, cold, cough, throat, rest, death." The cryptic note was accompanied by more of her remains, an unimaginable cruelty designed to prolong the family's suffering. It was clear that for Miyazaki, the emotional devastation he caused was as satisfying as the crimes themselves. Each message was carefully crafted to deepen the wounds, to remind the world that he alone held the power. By this point, the media had begun to take notice. Stories of the missing girls, combined with the bizarre letters and remains sent to their families, created a national sense of fear. The unknown predator became a specter haunting the streets, a reminder that no child was truly safe. Despite increased police patrols and public warnings, Miyazaki's reign of terror was not over. His final known victim was Ayako Nomoto, a 5-year-old girl who vanished on June 6, 1989. Once again, Miyazaki lured her into his car under the pretense of giving her a ride. But what he did to Ayako was even more disturbing than his previous crimes. After killing her, Miyazaki brought her remains back to his apartment. There, surrounded by his collection of anime, manga, and violent pornography, he spent days engaging in acts of necrophilia and mutilation. In a final act of depravity, he photographed the remains, preserving his crime as a trophy. When he was finished, Miyazaki disposed of her body in the woods, but not before severing her hands, which he kept as mementos. This gruesome ritual reflected the depth of his psychological disintegration. For Miyazaki, the boundary between life and death had ceased to matter. What remained was an all-consuming need to possess and destroy. Despite the meticulous care he had taken to avoid capture, fate intervened. On July 23, 1989, just weeks after killing Ayako Nomoto, Miyazaki's compulsion led to his downfall. That day, he was spotted attempting to lure 2 young girls into his car near a park in Tokyo. The girls escaped, but Miyazaki remained undeterred. Later that same day, he was caught photographing a young girl inappropriately at a park in Hachioji. Her father, enraged by what he witnessed, confronted Miyazaki and restrained him until the police arrived. At first, investigators believed they had caught nothing more than a petty voyeur. But as they began to search Miyazaki's apartment, the horrifying truth came to light. Behind the doors of his small, cluttered home lay a collection of evidence that connected him to the abductions and murders of the 4 young girls who had vanished over the past year. Chapter 4: The House of Horrors. When police first entered Tsutomu Miyazaki's apartment, they expected to find little more than a disorganized collection of manga and anime. What they discovered instead was a chilling window into the mind of a predator, an environment where his darkest fantasies had not only been nurtured, but allowed to flourish. The small, dimly lit apartment was filled with stacks of videotapes, over 5,000 in total. These tapes ranged from innocent cartoons to violent pornography, including disturbing depictions of torture and sexual violence. But hidden among them were the most incriminating pieces of evidence: videos and photographs documenting the crimes he had committed. These images left no doubt. Miyazaki had meticulously recorded his acts, preserving the memories to relive them again and again. In one corner of the apartment, officers found a collection of his victims' belongings, clothing, toys, and even fragments of their remains. Most chillingly, they discovered the severed hands of Ayako Nomoto, preserved and kept as grotesque trophies. These keepsakes were more than just reminders. They were symbols of Miyazaki's need to exert total control over his victims, even in death. The walls were plastered with drawings and clippings from horror magazines, reflecting an obsession with death and mutilation. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt, Miyazaki remained eerily calm during his interrogation. When asked why he had committed these unspeakable acts, he offered bizarre, detached explanations. At one point, he claimed that an alternate personality, a rat man, had taken control and forced him to kill. This attempt to evade responsibility only deepened the public's horror, painting him not just as a predator, but as someone utterly detached from human morality. The investigation revealed that Miyazaki's obsession with violence and death had been growing for years. His childhood isolation, combined with the emotional neglect he experienced at home, had created fertile ground for these dark impulses to take root. Yet while many struggled to understand what could drive a person to commit such atrocities, the evidence left little doubt. Tsutomu Miyazaki was fully aware of his actions and took pleasure in the suffering he caused. As the case against him grew, the nation grappled with the implications. How could someone living an ordinary life harbor such unimaginable darkness? And more disturbingly, were there others like him, waiting in the shadows?